The rain always returned on the exact same day each year, falling heavily from a grey, heavy sky as though nature itself remembered the tragedy that the rest of the busy world had chosen to forget. Eleanor Carter stood perfectly still and alone on the cold stone expanse of Blackstone Bridge. In her hands, she gripped a tightly bound bouquet of fresh white lilies, her knuckles pale against the stems. She gazed down into the dark, churning waters of the river, below the very river that had violently stolen her parents from her exactly 10 years ago today. Even after a decade, the memories remained terrifyingly clear. If she closed her eyes, Eleanor could still hear the rhythmic slapping of the rain against the car windshield. She remembered her parents, Richard and Sophia Carter, arguing in hushed, tense voices that they tried to hide from her. Then came the sudden, blinding flash of oncoming headlights, the screech of tires on wet asphalt, and the violent, crushing impact that shattered her childhood in a single fraction of a second. The official police report had quickly ruled the crash a tragic accident caused by poor visibility and slick roads. However, that simple explanation had never truly satisfied Eleanor. The local authorities seemed entirely too eager to close the file and move on. Instead of accepting their neat conclusion, Eleanor spent the next 10 years of her life searching for hidden truths. She became a dedicated investigative journalist, driven by a deep belief that every lie leaves a trail behind, no matter how carefully someone tries to wipe it away. After paying her quiet respects at the bridge, Eleanor returned to the bustling newsroom where she worked. She was exhausted, her mind heavy with memories. Just as she was gathering her things to leave for the night, the front desk receptionist stopped her and handed over a plain, unmarked brown paper package. It carried no postage stamps, no tracking numbers, and no return address. The only marking on the wrapping was her own name, written across the front in meticulous, sharp black ink. With a racing heart, Eleanor carried the package back to her desk and carefully tore it open. Inside lay an old, heavy brass key engraved with a distinct code, L317. Beneath the key was a partially burned photograph showing her parents standing next to a sleek black sedan, smiling nervously. Tucked under the photo was a folded piece of heavy paper containing a brief, chilling message. They didn't die because of the crash. Directly beneath the words was a hand-drawn symbol of a black raven with its wings spread wide. Eleanor examined the damaged photograph under her desk lamp and noticed terrifying details she had never seen in old family albums. In the deep shadows behind her parents, a tall man stood watching them, his face completely scratched away by a sharp blade. She turned the photo over and found a line of messy handwriting across the back. "He was watching us." The 5 discovery sent a wave of fear through her, but it also lit a fierce spark of determination. Whoever had sent this package knew the truth about that fatal night. Desperate for answers, Eleanor drove out to visit Daniel Cross, the retired police detective who had originally handled the crash investigation. Now an old man living in a secluded cabin, Cross seemed tired. However, the moment Eleanor placed the burned photograph and the raven symbol on his table, his entire face turned pale. He stared at the emblem, his hands trembling slightly, before admitting something he had hidden for a decade. There had been a second, highly classified investigation running alongside the official accident report. Before Eleanor could press him for details about who ordered the secrecy, Detective Cross stood up and abruptly ended the meeting. He looked at her with genuine worry and warned her that some truths were buried deeply for a reason. He urged her to drop the matter and destroy the package before she got herself hurt, or worse. But Eleanor knew she couldn't turn back now. The mystery had already taken hold of her life. The drive back to the city was dangerous, with a blinding rainstorm reducing visibility to near zero. As Eleanor navigated the slick streets, she noticed the headlights of a black sedan trailing behind her. No matter how many random turns she took through the city grid, the vehicle maintained a constant, watchful distance. Seeking safety in numbers, she pulled into a well-lit, crowded gas station. Through her rain-streaked window, she caught a brief glimpse of the driver. He was a calm, broad-shouldered man whose dark eyes carried a strange look of sympathy rather than malice. Before she could step out of her car, he shifted into reverse and disappeared into the rainy darkness. Late that night, Eleanor sat at her apartment table, surrounding herself with the mysterious clues. The brass key, the burned photograph, the unsettling note, and the faceless watcher all pointed to a massive, hidden conspiracy. As the clock neared midnight, the lights in her apartment flickered and died. A second later, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unlisted number. "The key opens more than doors." She stared at the screen, but before she could even hit reply, the text message vanished entirely, leaving her call history blank. A sudden chill washed over her. Eleanor walked slowly to her living room window and peered through the blinds into the rainy street below. There, standing perfectly still under a distant, flickering streetlight, was the same mysterious man from the black sedan. He was looking directly up at her apartment window. Eleanor blinked against the shadows, and in that split second, the man vanished into the dark alleyway. She was left alone in the dark, realizing with a mixture of dread and excitement that she was no longer just investigating the past, she was actively being hunted by it. The next morning, Eleanor woke up with a pounding headache after barely 2 hours of restless, nightmare-filled sleep. The anonymous package still sat on her small dining table, its contents laid out like a puzzle she couldn't yet solve. The brass key engraved with L. 317 seemed completely ordinary at first glance, yet it carried the terrifying weight of 10 years of silence. Beside it, the burned edges of the family photograph served as a constant reminder of the danger she was stepping into. Unable to leave the mystery behind, Eleanor packed the items into her bag and headed to the newsroom. Her senior editor, Michael Hayes, noticed her pale face and exhausted posture immediately. Sensing her distress, Eleanor pulled him into a private corner and showed him the burned photograph, explaining how the unmarked package had arrived the evening before. Michael, a veteran journalist who had seen his share of dangerous stories, immediately recognized the signs of a high-level cover-up. He warned her that whoever had destroyed the man's face in the photo wanted the past to stay dead and buried. Michael strongly urged Eleanor to take the evidence straight to the federal authorities, but she firmly shook her head. She reasoned that if whoever sent the package wanted law enforcement involved, they would have delivered it to the police station instead of her desk. Trusting the system was what had left her parents' deaths unexplained for 10 long years. Determined to find her own answers, Eleanor spent the rest of the morning at the city archives, demanding to see every public and municipal record related to her parents' crash. After waiting for hours in a dusty basement, an elderly archivist returned with a surprisingly thin, yellowed folder. When Eleanor opened it, she was shocked to find that almost every crucial document had been completely removed. The witness statements, the forensic crash site photos, the medical examiner's notes, and the initial police interviews were all gone. In their place was an official government authorization form, issued just 3 days after the crash, ordering the removal of the files. Even more troubling, the page numbers jumped directly from page 4 to page 9. 4 pages of vital evidence had been deliberately destroyed by someone with immense authority. With the paper trail gone, Eleanor turned to the only physical clue she had left, the brass key. After tracking the manufacturer's stamp through older business directories, she located a massive, crumbling storage facility on the neglected outskirts of the industrial district. The elderly caretaker at the front gate looked at the old key and recognized its specific design immediately. He guided Eleanor through a maze of cold, dusty corridors, their footsteps echoing off the concrete, until they arrived at locker L 317. The padlock was rusted, untouched for a decade. Eleanor inserted the brass key, turned it with all her strength, and felt the lock give way with a loud, metallic click. Inside the dark unit sat a single, heavy cardboard box sealed with faded tape. With trembling hands, Eleanor cut the tape and peered inside. The box contained an unexpected collection of items: old family vacations captured in photographs, expired international passports, stacks of newspaper clippings about corporate fraud, several cassette tapes, a blank VHS tape dated the exact day of her parents' crash, and a worn leather notebook. She opened the notebook and instantly recognized her father's neat, precise handwriting. The early pages contained standard business meetings and financial notes, but as she flipped further, the writing became frantic, messy, and large. One sentence was written repeatedly across the pages: "They're watching us." On the very last page, her father had written a final, terrifying warning: "Trust no one wearing the family name." Before Eleanor could process the meaning of her father's words, a massive metallic crash echoed through the silent warehouse. The heavy iron entrance doors to the facility had been violently slammed shut from the outside. The slow, deliberate sound of heavy footsteps began to echo down the long row of metal lockers toward her. The elderly caretaker called out her name in a panicked voice, but his shout was cut short by a dull thud and a heavy groan. Eleanor froze as a tall man dressed entirely in black appeared at the end of a corridor. He didn't rush at her to attack. Instead, he raised a single-gloved hand and pointed silently to the shadows directly behind her. Eleanor spun around quickly and caught a fleeting glimpse of another dark figure moving fast between the lockers. When she whipped her head back to face the first man, he had completely vanished into the gloom. An instant later, the main circuit breaker tripped, and every single light in the warehouse went out simultaneously. Eleanor was plunged into complete, suffocating darkness, surrounded by hidden enemies and the terrifying realization that someone had been waiting for her to open locker L317 all along. The heavy darkness inside the warehouse seemed to swallow every sound except for the frantic, rapid rhythm of Eleanor's own breathing. Pulling herself together, she reached into her jacket, pulled out her phone, and switched on its built-in flashlight. The narrow, bright beam cut through the thick dust of the abandoned corridors, casting long, twisting shadows against the metal locker doors. The cardboard box filled with secrets remained safely at her feet, but the two mysterious figures who had trapped her were nowhere to be seen. "Hello? Is anyone there? Caretaker?" she called out, her voice trembling in the cold air. No answer came from the darkness. Moving slowly with her flashlight, Eleanor swept the beam along the floor until she heard a faint, pained groan coming from the next aisle. She rushed around the corner and found the elderly caretaker slouched against the concrete wall, clutching his head. He was badly shaken and bruised, but thankfully alive. Someone had ambushed him from behind in the dark. As Eleanor helped him sit up, the old man whispered that right before he lost consciousness, he heard a deep, calm voice say a single sentence. She found it much sooner than expected. The cold words sent a shiver straight down Eleanor's spine. Whoever was pulling the strings already knew her movements and had anticipated her finding locker L317. Realizing the danger they were in, she quickly scooped up the contents of the box, stuffed them into her travel bag, and helped the caretaker out toward the emergency exit. As they burst out into the grey afternoon light, Eleanor saw a heavy black SUV speed away from the far edge of the property, its tires throwing up gravel. The mysterious, sympathetic watcher from the previous night was nowhere in sight. Safely back in her apartment with the deadbolts thrown, Eleanor spread the contents of her father's secret box across the living room floor. She began to examine the items with a journalist's eye, and what she found rewrote her entire life story. The expired passports didn't bear her parents' real names. Instead, Richard and Sophia Carter had traveled under completely fabricated identities. The old newspaper clippings detailed high-profile corruption scandals, mysterious disappearances of public officials, and unexplained corporate deaths from over a decade ago. Several of the most prominent headlines had been aggressively circled in dark red ink. One specific clipping from a local paper immediately caught her attention. It reported the sudden, unexplained disappearance of a brilliant investigative journalist named Olivia Brooks, who had vanished just 2 weeks before the car crash that killed Eleanor's parents. Written directly in the margin of the article, in her father's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 words: "She knew too much." Eleanor's heart sank. She refused to believe her kind, loving father could be mixed up in something so dark, yet a terrible seed of doubt began to grow in her mind. Seeking more definitive proof, Eleanor took one of the old cassette tapes and inserted it into a vintage tape recorder she had borrowed from her office archives. She pressed play. Heavy static filled the quiet apartment for several long seconds before the audio cleared, revealing 2 distinct voices that made Eleanor gasp. It was her mother and father, their voices tight with absolute terror. "They're closing in on us, Richard. We don't have time," her mother's voice pleaded. "We leave tonight, Sophia." "Grab the essentials," her father replied, his voice strained. "What about Eleanor? What do we tell her? She doesn't know anything. It's safer that way. We keep her in the dark." The recording ended abruptly with the harsh sound of a heavy car door slamming shut, followed by the drone of static. Eleanor replayed the short tape over and over again, tears welling in her eyes. Her parents weren't ordinary citizens who died in a random accident. They were fugitives running for their lives from a danger they had kept hidden from her. The next clue was the unmarked VHS tape. Lacking the proper equipment to play it, Eleanor drove back out to Detective Daniel Cross's cabin, knowing the old lawman still kept a working video player. At first, Cross was angry that she had returned and refused to touch the tape, but Eleanor's fierce stare and determination finally broke his resolve. He sighed, pushed the tape into the machine, and the old television screen flickered to life with grainy, black-and-white footage. The video showed her parents sitting at a crude wooden table inside what looked like an empty warehouse. Her father, Richard, looked completely exhausted, with deep dark circles under his eyes, while her mother, Sophia, kept glancing nervously toward the room's entrance as if she expected an army to burst through at any moment. Richard leaned forward, looking directly into the camera lens with a desperate expression. "If this recording is ever found by anyone, it means our escape plan has failed completely," Richard said solemnly. "The people we worked for will stop at nothing to ensure our silence. You need to understand the truth about—" Before he could finish his sentence, the loud sound of a heavy door being kicked open echoed from the television speakers. Richard's face twisted in fear. He reached out toward the camera, and the footage instantly cut to black, leaving a low hum filling the cabin room. Daniel Cross stood up slowly and switched off the television, the room falling into a tense silence. "This changes everything, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice cracking with age. "I had no idea it went this deep." Before Eleanor could ask him what he meant, a sudden, deafening blast shattered the peace of the cabin. A high-velocity bullet tore through the front window, showering the room in a cloud of exploding glass. Acting on pure instinct, Eleanor and Daniel dropped heavily to the floor as a second shot punched a clean hole through the wooden wall right above their heads. Eleanor crawled through the glass, dragging the old detective behind a heavy kitchen counter as more shots echoed outside. Within minutes, the gunfire stopped as the hidden shooter retreated into the woods before the police could be called. Daniel looked at Eleanor with absolute terror in his eyes, his face bleeding from a small glass cut. "They know you opened the locker, Eleanor. They're trying to clear the board." Later that night, tucked away in a safe, anonymous motel room, Eleanor opened her father's leather notebook once more. Carefully feeling along the inside lining of the cover, she discovered a hidden compartment containing a neatly folded map. She opened it and saw a single location marked with a hand-drawn black raven symbol. Beneath the map, written in fresh, dark ink that didn't belong to her father, was a simple message: "If you want the truth, come alone." For the first time, Eleanor fully understood that she wasn't just digging up an old family mystery. Someone powerful was actively guiding her toward the center of the web, while someone else was entirely willing to kill her to keep it hidden. The city streets were dead quiet long after midnight as Eleanor studied the map she had discovered hidden within her father's old notebook. The stark black raven symbol marked an isolated spot on the eastern edge of the city, an abandoned, decaying railway station that had been shut down for decades. There were no specific street addresses or instructions included, only the destination itself. Every journalistic instinct she possessed screamed that this was an incredibly dangerous trap, yet she knew deep down that she had no choice. She had to follow the trail to its end. The following afternoon, Eleanor arrived at the deserted station. Thick red rust coated the old tracks, shattered glass from broken windows littered the platforms, and a heavy, uneasy silence hung in the damp air. She slipped through a gap in the perimeter fence and made her way toward the old central control room. Resting on a dusty table in the middle of the room was a sealed white envelope. Written across the front was her name, Eleanor. She tore it open and read the brief, handwritten message inside. "You're asking the wrong question, Eleanor. Stop looking for who killed your parents. Start asking who they really were." Before she could read the words a second time, the sharp sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the concrete building forced her to react. Eleanor ducked into a dark, narrow maintenance corridor and pressed herself against the wall just as two large men dressed in matching black suits strode into the control room. They noticed the opened envelope immediately, and one of them pulled out a phone to make a quick call. "She's already been here," the man said into the receiver, his voice cold and emotionless. He listened for a moment before replying, "No, she doesn't know the full story yet." The man hung up and turned to his partner, ordering him to bring him down to the garage. The words sent a cold wave of dread through Eleanor. Instead of running for the exit, she quietly followed the two men as they walked deep into the bowels of the station. They led her down into a subterranean maintenance garage where a single, bare light bulb hung from a long cord, casting a harsh glow over the concrete floors. Tied securely to a heavy metal chair directly beneath the light was the mysterious man Eleanor had seen watching her from the black sedan. His face was badly bruised and cut, his shirt torn, but his eyes remained calm. The two men in suits stood over him, demanding to know where Richard Carter's notebook was hidden and accusing him of betraying them to contact Eleanor. Despite receiving several heavy blows to the face, the man refused to say a single word. When one of the operatives lost his patience and pulled a silenced pistol from his jacket, pointing it directly at the man's head, the stranger simply looked up and whispered, "You've already lost." Watching the horror unfold from the shadows of a nearby doorway, Eleanor shifted her weight in shock and accidentally stepped on a piece of thick, broken glass. The sharp, loud crunch echoed like a gunshot through the empty concrete garage. Instantly, every head whipped around toward her position. "There she is. Grab her!" one of the gunmen shouted. Eleanor turned and ran faster than she ever had in her life, sprinting through a maze of pitch-black service tunnels with the heavy footsteps of her pursuers gaining ground behind her. Just as she reached a dead end and felt a hand grab her shoulder, a shadow lunged from the darkness. It was the mysterious stranger from the chair. He had somehow snapped his ropes and escaped his captors. With incredible speed, he tackled the closest gunman to the floor, grabbed Eleanor by the arm, and pulled her into a hidden, narrow emergency escape passage. They ran 31 through the damp tunnel until they finally burst out into the thick, rainy forest that bordered the old railway property, leaving the sound of shouting far behind them. Only after they had run deep into the safety of the trees did the stranger finally slow down and release her arm. He wiped a streak of blood from his forehead and introduced himself simply as Marcus. He admitted to a shocked Eleanor that he had been watching over her from a distance for several years, not out of a desire to harm her, but to keep her alive. When Eleanor angrily demanded to know exactly who was trying to kill her and what her parents were involved in, Marcus looked at her with deep pity. "The people who want you dead are the members of the organization your parents spent their lives working for and eventually tried to escape," he explained quietly. Before she could ask him to elaborate, Marcus slipped a small, metallic flash drive into her hand and told her it contained the first real, unedited truth about her family. Before the distant sound of police sirens could reach the station, Marcus turned and melted into the pouring rain, leaving her alone once more. Back in the temporary safety of her apartment, Eleanor inserted the flash drive into her laptop with a shaking hand. But instead of opening a standard file directory, her computer screen began to violently flicker and distort. A dark red warning message suddenly locked her screen, reading, "Stop digging. You are being watched. The next time we see you, we won't miss." A second later, the entire laptop short-circuited and the monitor went completely black. As Eleanor sat frozen, staring at her own reflection in the dead screen, she heard a faint, distinct creak of a floorboard coming from the hallway right behind her chair. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Slowly, terrified to breathe, she turned her head toward the pitch-black corridor of her home, realizing with absolute horror that she was no longer alone in her apartment. The city had never been quieter than it was on that cold, grey morning. It wasn't because the streets were empty of cars, but rather because almost every single citizen was glued to a television screen. Inside crowded cafes, busy airport terminals, quiet hospital waiting rooms, and private living rooms, every single broadcast carried the exact same earth-shattering headline, "The Sovereign Circle Exposed." For nearly 3 decades, this shadow organization had existed silently behind the scenes of national governments, massive global corporations, international charities, and powerful federal courtrooms. They were the hidden puppeteers who had secretly influenced major elections, buried career-ending criminal investigations, bribed high-ranking officials, and permanently silenced anyone who came too close to discovering their existence. To the public, the members of the Circle were respected billionaires, beloved politicians, highly decorated judges, and generous philanthropists. In reality, they were the secret architects of countless unsolved tragedies. Now, in a stunning turn of events, they were being arrested live on television one by one. The mountain of evidence released to every major news outlet over the previous 48 hours was completely undeniable. It included secret offshore financial records, encrypted communication logs, signed witness testimonies from former operatives, hidden camera video recordings, and massive ledgers detailing decades of criminal activity. It was an unstoppable avalanche of truth that connected hundreds of high-profile crimes that investigators had spent decades trying to solve. Across the entire country, federal search warrants were being executed simultaneously at sunrise. High-security luxury mansions were raided by tactical teams, private corporate offices were sealed with police tape, and hidden underground vaults were cracked open. The vast, corrupt empire that had ruled from the dark shadows for a generation collapsed in a matter of hours. Families of victims gathered outside police stations, weeping openly as they finally received the answers they had prayed for over the years. Some finally learned the true fate of missing children, while others discovered that their loved ones had actually been murdered by the Circle for getting too close to the truth. Justice had finally arrived, but as the crowds cheered, everyone knew that justice could never return the stolen years or bring back the dead. Marcus stood quietly across the street from the federal courthouse, watching armed officers escort the remaining top leaders of the Sovereign Circle through the grand entrance. The rain fell steadily around him, soaking his coat. A senior detective walked up to him and stood by his side, watching the historic moment. "It's finally over, Marcus," the detective said quietly. "The last remaining board member confessed an hour ago. They're all talking now." Marcus remained silent for a long moment, watching the ruined men in handcuffs. "They're only talking because they don't have a choice anymore," he replied, his voice empty of joy. The detective folded his arms and looked at him with respect. "You spent 12 long years of your life chasing these monsters, Marcus. Does it feel worth it now?" Marcus looked across the plaza at the families embracing each other through tears. He saw children hugging grandparents and parents weeping with relief. Finally, he spoke. "I always thought exposing them would magically erase the pain of what they took from me. It doesn't." The detective paused, looking at him. "Then what does it do?" Marcus looked up at the grey sky. "It makes sure no one else has to live through the nightmare we survived." To the exact same time, a team of federal investigators returned to the massive Carter estate on the edge of the city. The grand mansion, once admired for its beautiful architecture, stood abandoned and dark behind rusted iron gates. Every square inch of the house had already been searched multiple times by local police, yet one glaring question remained unanswered. Why had Richard Carter spent nearly all his time locked inside his private study during the final weeks leading up to his death? An architect reviewing the building's original, century-old blueprints noticed a small discrepancy in the measurements. The physical dimensions of the room didn't match the paperwork. There was an unused, hidden space built directly behind the main library wall. Using heavy tools, workers carefully removed the elegant wooden panels of the bookshelf. Behind them stood a heavy, reinforced steel security door. After cutting through the hinges, they found a narrow, concrete room that had remained completely untouched for over 10 years. A thick layer of dust covered every single surface. There was no vast fortune of stolen money inside, no hidden weapons, and no secret escape tunnel. There was only a small, fireproof metal safe resting perfectly in the center of the floor. After several hours of work, technicians managed to crack the safe's combination. Inside lay a single, plain white envelope. Its paper had yellowed significantly with age. Across the front, written carefully in the precise black ink Eleanor knew so well, were 4 words, "For my daughter only." The envelope was delivered directly to Eleanor under heavy police supervision. Not a single officer had opened it, no detective had photographed it, and no curious journalist was allowed anywhere near it. Its contents belonged strictly to her. Inside the envelope rested several handwritten pages. Her father's handwriting started out neat and controlled for the first few paragraphs before gradually becoming erratic and uneven as his emotions took over. The letter began simply, "If you're reading this, Eleanor, then our world has already ended. I spent many years foolishly believing I could control the consequences of my dark decisions. I was terribly wrong." In the pages that followed, Richard Carter confessed to everything. He described in detail how he and Sophia had willingly joined the Sovereign Circle long before Eleanor was even born. At first, they were led to believe the organization was simply an exclusive club connecting powerful, influential people to help the community. But by the time they discovered the true, murderous nature of the group, they were already completely trapped. Leaving the circle meant an immediate death sentence for them and their newborn daughter. Staying meant becoming active cogs in a terrible, destructive machine. They chose to stay and survive. Richard explained how every criminal compromise became easier than the last. Accepting a bribe became normal behavior. Destroying vital police evidence became a standard routine. Threatening innocent witnesses became a necessary duty. Looking away while good, innocent people disappeared without a trace became their definition of survival. Years passed before either of them realized they no longer recognized the monsters they had become. Richard confessed that every expensive family vacation, every happy birthday celebration, and every beautiful photograph Eleanor remembered from her childhood had been paid for with the intense suffering of strangers. The life she remembered as perfect had been purchased entirely with someone else's pain. Near the very end of the long letter, the handwriting became incredibly shaky, as if his hands were trembling with tears. "Every terrible decision we made was justified with the exact same excuse, Eleanor. We told ourselves we were doing it all for you, to secure your future. That was the greatest, most cowardly lie we ever chose to believe. We weren't protecting our beloved daughter. We were simply protecting our own fear. Power changes people slowly. eroding their morals until evil begins to feel completely ordinary. Never defend our names to the world, Eleanor. Remember us honestly, flaws and all. If anyone in this tragedy deserves forgiveness, it certainly isn't us. There was no formal signature at the bottom of the page. There were only two simple, faded initials. R.C. Weeks quickly turned into months as the massive trials of the Sovereign Circle continued to dominate the news. Every single courtroom session revealed another horrifying secret to the public. Hidden mass graves were discovered outside abandoned industrial factories. Secret financial ledgers permanently connected dozens of historical disappearances directly to the living members of the Circle. Independent journalists, whose careers and investigations had been ruined years earlier, were finally vindicated and given justice. Hurting families were finally given closure and names instead of a lifetime of unanswered questions. Throughout the highly publicized investigations, the names of Richard and Sophia Carter appeared repeatedly in federal court transcripts. They were not remembered as innocent victims of a tragic accident, nor were they celebrated as heroes who exposed the truth. Instead, history recorded them exactly as Richard had requested, as flawed, powerful people who chose comfort and influence until it completely consumed them. The world finally saw them truthfully. On a quiet afternoon, Marcus visited his father's grave one final time. The peaceful cemetery overlooked rolling green hills where the evening wind carried the fresh, crisp scent of pine trees. He walked up to the weathered headstone and gently placed a single white lily against the base. For 12 bitter years, Marcus had imagined that achieving total revenge against the Circle would finally heal the deep wounds in his heart. But standing there in the quiet twilight, he finally understood a profound truth. Revenge simply ends a life, but the truth has the power to change history forever. He smiled sadly at the headstone and whispered, "I kept my promise, Dad." The gentle wind carried his word. Months later, demolition crews arrived at the Carter estate and reduced the grand mansion to absolute rubble. The heavy stone walls collapsed, the stained glass windows shattered into dust, and the memory of their wealth filled the air in a cloud of grey powder. But beneath the deep concrete foundations of the house, construction workers discovered a series of hidden filing cabinets. Inside were pristine, untouched documents and evidence linked to dozens of cold cases from across the state. Every single file reopened a new investigation, and every investigation gave another grieving family the truth they had waited a lifetime to hear. The physical mansion disappeared completely from the earth, as though it had never existed at all. Far away from the noise of the city, far from the flashing cameras of the reporters, and far from the crowded courtrooms, a lone figure stood at the very edge of the vast ocean just before sunrise. The dark waves rolled gently across the wet sand, whispering in the cool morning air. In her right hand, Eleanor held her father's final, yellowed letter. In her left hand, she held the faded family photograph, the exact same photo that had started her dangerous search for answers months ago. It was the same photo that had once represented pure, uncomplicated love to a young girl. Now, it represented something far more complicated, dark, and human. For several long moments, Eleanor didn't move a muscle, watching the first light of dawn color the sky. Then, with a deep, cleansing breath, she let her fingers relax. The old family photograph slipped from her hand and fell into the receding tide. The ocean waves swept over it, carrying the smiling faces of her parents farther and farther out into the deep sea until they completely disappeared beneath the dark water. Only the handwritten letter remained tightly gripped in her hand. It wasn't because her father's words deserved to be treasured or honored, but because history deserved to remember the truth of what had happened. The coastal wind grew stronger, blowing her hair across her face as the first bright rays of sunlight broke completely across the horizon, painting the world in gold. Eleanor looked out at the endless expanse of the ocean before quietly turning her back on the water and walking away. No words were spoken into the morning air. Some endings needed absolute silence more than grand speeches. Behind her, the incoming tide quickly washed over the sand, erasing every single footprint she had left behind. The painful past could never be undone, the dead would never return to life, and the innocent victims could never regain the beautiful years that had been stolen from them by greedy men. But the truth had survived the darkness. And sometimes, the truth is the only meaningful thing we can leave behind.